Our next presenter, Jennika Hunsinger, started with the Medway Community Forest Co-op in the summer of 2019 to kickstart a baseline biodiversity study while completing a Master's of Forestry or Forest Conservation degree at the University of Toronto. Originally hailing from Ontario with family roots in Yarmouth, Jennika relocated to Nova Scotia to attend Dow for her undergraduate studies. She's a registered professional forester and an avid gardener, camper, and traveler. In her current role, she manages outreach and research programs with the MCFC and is leading the launch of the Nova Scotia Working Woodlands Trust. I think you might be very interested to hear about this, which is what Jennika is going to tell us about right now. Welcome, Jennika.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. It's lovely to spend the day with you all here. I think there's a wealth of knowledge in the room, and I hope if we haven't chatted yet so far, I have a booth set up at the front door, and maybe we can chat. I'd love to learn from you and what you're doing in your woodlands. So I'm here to introduce you to a new tool in the Land Conservation Toolkit to be able to offer land stewards an option to secure their forests and stewardship legacy, still while maintaining access to economic benefits through harvesting timber forest products, all under ecosystem-based forest management principles, as well as to offer landowners and land stewards an ability to connect to carbon offset markets, as James introduced earlier. Can you hear me? I'm stepping on the cord. That's not helpful. All right, so just to sort of start, this new initiative has been incubated through the Medway Community Forest Cooperative, which is a member-based community organization piloting alternatives to traditional crown land management in Annapolis County, so managing 15,000 hectares of the old low-water lands. And this is all done through balancing multiple values and practicing ecological-based forest management. MCFC is managed by a voluntary board of directors with 2 seats for representatives for each economic, ecological, social, as well as First Nations, and 2 seats for members at large. And the development of this new land trust came out of a need with over 50% of forests managed privately and by an aging population without an option to secure their forest stewardship legacy or maintain woodlands. So really quickly, just a snapshot of our team. There's myself and my colleague Matt Miller, who's the general manager for the Medway Community Forest Co-op. We're hiring an executive director, so we'll be 3 soon, and looking to grow as well. There's a new project we've taken on to support hemlock woolly adelgid treatment as well. So our team of 2 is rapidly growing. And then our board of directors there, really just to share that we represent woodland stewards and stewardship organizations across the province. And just to start this chat off and to connect to what Lacey and Elizabeth shared, integrating Mi'kmaq values is an important aspect of land stewardship. Of course, both MCFC and the New Land Trust are settler-based organizations. And we acknowledge the conservation movement in Canada has largely benefited from the appropriation of Indigenous lands, and that colonial systems have historically created barriers for Indigenous people to access private lands. So as we move forward in launching this new land trust and the actions we take in the forest, we commit to educating ourselves and the landowners we work with by listening to Indigenous partners and integrating traditional uses on easement properties and two-eyed seeing into management practices. We commit to continue to create opportunities to donate lands to Indigenous communities and promote open access on easement properties, and commit to building relationships, alleviating barriers, and continuing to have hard conversations. We're all on the path of reconciliation, so continuing to move forward together. So why a woodlot steward? We recognized the concept of private ownership was unfamiliar to the original inhabitants of Mi'kmaq, the Mi'kmaq people, and using the expression woodland stewards acknowledges that private lands may never have been legally ceded or sold to settlers. So we asked private woodland owners to reconsider their relationship with private land ownership as a concept, and instead vow to act as stewards to the forest, maintaining it as a resource for future generations, remembering that 7-generation concept that Elizabeth and Lacey shared this morning. All right, so why build a working woodlands trust? The great news for us is that these models exist in other jurisdictions. There's wonderful working forest easements that exist in Maine and Vermont, just south of the border in the Canadian Forest region as well. So we get to look to those models of success to see what we can bring to Nova Scotia and offer landowners here. So as I mentioned, the majority of land stewards are in retirement and may not have a clear succession plan for who will manage their woodlands after their time, or may not know what happens to the land when they sell. There's a number of different scenarios that occur, which can result in poor forestry practices. Laid out a couple up here. The first being the successors of the inheritors of the forest may be displaced, either living in an urban environment far from the forest, or maybe they're in another province or overseas, and unable or uninterested in managing the forest after their time. And the other two there are a little bit tied to economics. When land transfers hands, the capital gains tax falls to the new landowner, or in any economic pinch in life, landowners may look to the forest to liquidate to cover any expenses. So really the easement and this new land trust model serve to protect forest health and uphold forest stewardship legacies and support a diversity of revenue generating opportunities for landowners. No surprise to anyone, in addition to risks of lands changing hands, some common threats to the forest include land conversion, either liquidation logging or clear cutting, which is a beautiful picture up there, the agriculture in the blueberry fields, as well as subdivision. And this picture is down in southwest Nova Scotia, which is where I've been working for the last few years. In the Malega Lakes area. And so you see those lakeside properties, forests being subdivided into smaller and smaller parcels for second homes or cottages. So really the vision for a working woodlands trust is to benefit the community and the environment, as well as woodlot owners. So generally maintaining forest cover and growing quality forest products to help sustain income for the long term instead of that liquidation logging and short-term economic gains. To support landscape connectivity and contiguous cover forestry across our province and support wildlife and carbon and a number of values. And to promote ecological forestry through climate adaptive silviculture and advanced forest health and successional pathways. So the land trust can help support landowners in management planning, but also provide resources for things like Cindy Stacer shared earlier around species at risk and best management practices. Oh, I've gone too far. So the new land trust will support landowners and woodland stewards by upholding their forest stewardship legacy and forest health. So many private landowners have had the forest passed down for generations, and I've chatted with folks who are 9th generation, 7th generation woodland stewards. So maintaining that legacy far into the future. The easement will support sustainable harvesting, and the easement ties FSC's Forest Certified Management Plan to the property deed itself, as well as incorporates land stewards' goals into the property in perpetuity, regardless of who owns that property down the line. So to cover the cost of these easements, we're providing an opportunity for individuals to access carbon markets and to issue any additional revenue. So once the endowment to manage that property and the easement is met, any additional revenue is returned back to the landowners over the course of that agreement. I'll share more about carbon offsets in a minute. So working forest easements will be upheld through the Community Easements Act. This came to be in 2012 in our province. which is quite a unique act and piece of legislation that helps support a diversity in values, but one of which is for working forests. To date, no other organizations come forward to fill that, so MCFC started creating this new land trust. And it really aims to complement the existing conservation-focused land trusts and the new Mi'kmaq Land Trust. Easements will be upheld through satellite imagery and annual monitoring and stewardship, and with an endowment and a legal defense fund. The land trust will own land through direct acquisition, as well as accept donated lands. So the community easement is a legally binding agreement between the land trust and the landowner, and it's tied to the property deed in perpetuity. Within the agreement are agreed practices and limitations to future property development and natural resource extraction. And the actual, down there in the bottom it says, the actual forest management services will be provided through the existing regional service provider network, folks like the Western Woodlot Services Co-op, North Nova, Big Breton Private Land Partnership. There's already a great network of folks out there, so they'll be partners under the trust. And there's just a map of those folks who support landowners with management plans, contracts for harvesting, silviculture, operation supervision, and all of that good stuff. So we don't need to reinvent the wheel. And as Daniel shared this morning about the Family Forest Network, the Nova Scotia Woodlot Woodlands Trust is a part of that group as well. All right, so diving into those agreed practices, we start by looking at land use zoning. We recognize that many woodlots and woodlands have multiple purposes, and in the easement drafting phase, we would carve out any agriculture lands, including Christmas trees, the house or any residential zones, and tie the easement just to the forest itself. Within the forest zone, it would be broken down into that matrix-style leg of the triad model, the ecosystem-based or improved forest management zone, where management would be continued, as well as carve out conservation zones for forever wilds and potentially protecting old-growth forests on private lands as well. I think we've got a nice picture of a little off-grid cabin within the forest zone. Small recreational off-grid cabins would be delineated at the time, or any future development could be done there as well. So within the working forest zone, there would be permitted, restricted, and prohibited activities. And they're pretty broad. It just sort of highlights how these activities would be managed. So permitted anywhere, anytime, low impact hiking, trail clearing, foraging, any recreational uses, of course, encouraged in the forest. The restricted activities include any of the harvesting and silviculture, any new road construction or restoration projects, and they would just require 60-day notice to the trust to maintain communication. And prohibited across the entire forest zone would be subdivision, liquidation, or unsustainable harvesting. And I'll get into a definition of ecological forestry a little bit, but largely anything with a 60% basal area removal or higher would be deemed as inappropriate. I'll just highlight here that in the conservation zones, of course, those restricted activities, harvesting and road building, would not be suitable. So the definition of ecological forestry, maybe this isn't news to anybody, but I'll just reiterate it. Any merchantable and non-merchantable forestry activities or silviculture that considers climate adaptivity and mimics the natural disturbances while maintaining biodiversity features and ecological function, as well as our conservation zones and forever wild zones. And prohibited on the easement property would be any unsustainable or ecologically inappropriate forestry, including clear cutting, overstory removal, or the removal of permanent retention features within any forestry activity. So it's a new land trust that we've been working on developing over the last couple of years, and we're ready to launch, nearly. We're just waiting on an approval of our application application to be an eligible body in the Community Easements Act, and then we'll be all ready to support landowners and start looking at woodlands and delineating easements. So as we begin to launch, we're looking first at properties that are greater than 50 acres. That's not set in stone, that's not going to be that way forever, just as we're looking to take off here. We're going to launch with at least 10,000 acres across the province. So we kind of want to get there with a smaller group to start, and then we'll build and keep growing. So smaller properties may be included over time. Within that minimum of 50 acres, over half of the forest should be mature, over 40 years of age, and could be either in a natural or managed state. Each easement property is required to have an FSC certified forest management plan. And it's up to the landowners to maintain boundary lines as well. Some additional considerations for properties are if they support contiguous landscapes and help build easement clusters, so the larger forest area the better for wildlife and other ecological values. If a property provides public access to recreational opportunities, trails, and mountain biking, all that is welcome as a community easement. It only builds value. And a property with minimal human structure, as well as pits, anything that is risky and could create pollutants in the environment is helpful. As well as there are wildlife or special habitat features. All right, so all of this, upholding easements costs money. We know that from the traditional conservation, like Nova Scotia Nature Trust, or Nature Conservancy of Canada, they rely heavily on philanthropy and fundraising. And this is where we turn to the carbon offset market as an opportunity. So for the endowments, that cost is largely dependent on the woodland size, the distance to travel to it, and the risk of infractions. And the endowment will cover annual monitoring, liability costs, and include negotiations and legal defense fund. So we estimate the lifetime cost of upholding an easement to be about $100 an acre. So looking to the carbon offset market to finance that endowment, as I mentioned, the Land Trust will launch with 10,000 acres, and so the Land Trust will serve as an aggregator to bring together a network of easement properties. That sort of 10,000 acre mark relates to some of the things that James shared earlier, that the current existing carbon offset markets right now on the voluntary market, it requires a large enough scale to access that market. So the scale is required for project feasibility to bring a substantial carbon credit volume to the market. So the Land Trust will keep track of each property's volume and inventory carbon, and then utilize that revenue to pay the endowment for the property. And within the first, we estimate that in the first 2 to 3 years of that sale, the endowment would be covered and the lifetime management of that property. And then additional revenue would be paid to the landowners over the course of a 20-year issuance. James did mention the federal program pending, coming online soon. So where we're currently at, that wouldn't change if that came up today. We would still go forward and inventory carbon, and at the time of making the sale, we could choose to go to the American Carbon Registry, which is the voluntary market, through the Improved Forest Management Protocol. It's a verified process, so we could go that route today. Or if the federal market's online and the prices are looking pretty good, we could hop into that market as well. So there's some flexibility there. A bit more detail. The carbon offsets are a 40-year agreement, and they work really well in partnership with the easement agreement itself. Carbon programs do vary considerably, but through the Improved Forest Management Protocol, the monitoring of the easements and the litigation to secure and grow forest carbon in perpetuity, these two programs come together really well. The stewardship and silvicultural practices that promote healthy forests and tree growth can enhance carbon sequestration and storage. and improve stand resilience to climate change. So the easement will secure the stored carbon for the long-term benefits. So it's pretty nice to be able to, if you are interested, or if anyone is interested in the easement, that you can have access to that program. The carbon in your woods will pay for the endowment, and then you'll see additional revenue and see carbon as a new product class for you. This is a snapshot of the money. Everyone always wants to know. This is not a guarantee. It's sort of a price estimate based on the minimum price, but we expect the value to be a fair bit higher. But it just sort of lays out how the breakdown of the value goes. And you can see that the endowment is covered there. It's about 31% of the total revenue. And then there's additional costs towards admin, insurance, and inventory. And then the rest goes back to the landowner.
Is that per year?
That's over the total 40-year term of the agreement. So the full project, yeah, not per year. I went off script, so did I miss anything here? No. So I did mention that there are conservation zones of potential to be in an easement. A part of that, and I'm going to share on the next slide, is a potential to recognize OECMs, another acronym for us to remember, other effective area-based conservation measures. You don't have to remember that, but it is an international recognition under the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And having an old forest or a conservation zone a part of your easement, and if you're able to work with the land trust to have OECM recognition of that conservation zone, those are sorts of things that can help build the story when selling carbon offsets. As an international recognition, it could greatly improve the value of the carbon that we're taking to market. So this is my final slide here. And I just wanted to share, we kind of ran through what the land trust is, why, what's it all about, what are the benefits of it, and how it would kind of look on the landscape, some of those green practices, and the costs and revenue to support from carbon offsets to cover that endowment. And these are just a few other program opportunities that the land trust can help facilitate and connect landowners to. So I did mention the other effective area-based conservation measures. I'm going to read out a portion of this. It is a geographically defined area other than a protected area, which is governed and managed in a way that achieves positive and sustained long-term outcomes for the in-situ conservation of biodiversity with associated ecosystem functions and services where applicable. It goes on. But we have some program support to help recognize private lands and easements in their conservation zones as OECMs. And that OECM recognition will help support, potentially help support Nova Scotia and federal protected area goals, so having private lands help contribute to those targets that were mentioned earlier. And finally, we talked about hemlock as our oldest species in the province, in the Canadian Forest region, our 532-year-old hemlock. They are at risk. It's likely not news to you that hemlock woolly adelgid is in our province. It's an invasive pest. It is a likely death and decline to hemlock trees that are infested. It's down in southwest Nova Scotia. It's all around me. But maybe up in this neck of the woods, it's not as ever present in your daily life. But if you ever get down to Kedgie or the Tobeatic, you'll see that the hemlock there are kind of turning yellow or gray, and that the undersides of those needles are covered in white woolly sacs from the invasive pest. It's causing death and decline of hemlock trees. So there is treatment support available now through Nature's Smart Climate Solutions Fund. The Federal Environmental Climate Change Program has agreed to commit $10 million to support hemlock conservation for its carbon value, for its old growth value. So treatment is underway in protected areas and on crown lands. And through an easement and conservation zones on private lands, we can help connect landowners to treatment options for their hemlock as well. as well as just a help support for tree planting if folks are interested in accessing the federal 2 billion trees commitment to plant climate adaptive species and help support stand and habitat restoration. And that's all I had to share today, so thanks so much.